The sanctuary's secret lyric Starweaver had been expecting them for 300 years. She stood at the observation deck of her sanctuary, watching the small fleet approach through the swirling cosmic dust that concealed the hollow asteroid from casual detection. Her eyes, ancient beyond her apparent age of 30, holding depths that spoke of centuries spent in contemplation, tracked the familiar energy signatures of Xerion vessels alongside the more conventional designs of draconian warships and human mining craft. The sanctuary itself was a marvel that defied easy description. Carved from the interior of an asteroid nearly 50 kilometers in diameter, it resembled less a space station and more a living city. Crystalline spires twisted upward, from terraced gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in defiance of vacuum and radiation. Waterfalls cascaded in slow-motion spirals through the low gravity, their mist catching and refracting light from bioluminescent panels that painted everything in shifting hues of blue and gold. But it was the inhabitants that truly set the sanctuary apart. Beings from 100 different worlds moved through the crystal corridors, some humanoid, others so alien that their basic physiology challenged understanding. What they all shared, without exception, were the telltale patterns of Xerion armor integration, the faint luminescent traceries beneath their skin, the subtle harmonic resonance in their voices, the way reality seemed to bend slightly around them as if acknowledging their connection to forces beyond normal physics. "Mistress Lyric," came a melodic voice from behind her. She turned to see Naya, one of her oldest companions, approaching with the fluid grace that marked all the armor chosen. Naya's species resembled crystalline spiders, but the Xerion integration had transformed her into something that seemed more like living art than biology. "The newcomers request permission to dock. Shall I prepare the greeting chambers?" Lyric nodded, her long silver hair catching the light from the nearest biopanel. She had been human once, or mostly human. The exact details were fuzzy after so many centuries of integration with technologies that existed as much in dimensions of thought as in physical space. What mattered was that she remembered enough of mortality to understand the confusion and fear that the newly chosen always experienced. "Prepare chambers 7 through 12. And Naya? Have the memory crystals brought to the Hall of Echoes. They'll need to understand what they've become part of." As Naya glided away to make preparations, Lyric returned her attention to the approaching fleet. She could feel them now through the quantum field that connected all Xerion technology. 3 distinct presences burning like stars against the backdrop of space. The human archaeologist blazed with desperate curiosity and barely controlled power. The draconian commander carried the weight of his people's extinction alongside a hunter's, instincts gradually being transformed into something deeper. And scattered throughout their escort fleet, she sensed others beginning to awaken. Crew members and passengers whose proximity to the armor was triggering their own latent connections to the Xerion legacy. It had been like this for millennia. Ever since the Great Sundering had scattered the armor fragments across the galaxy, individuals would stumble upon pieces, be chosen by them, and then inevitably find their way to places like this sanctuary. Most came seeking answers. What they found was responsibility on a scale that challenged sanity. The docking process took nearly an hour. The sanctuary's bays were designed to accommodate vessels that didn't always follow conventional physics, and the mixture of Xerion, human, and draconian technologies required careful calibration to prevent unfortunate interactions. Lyric waited patiently, using the time to commune with the sanctuary's central consciousness, feeling the vast network of minds that had contributed to its growth over the centuries. When the newcomers finally entered the Hall of Echoes, she was ready for them. Zara Blackthorn entered first, and Lyric immediately understood why the armor had chosen her. Beneath the xenoarchaeologist's weathered exterior burned an intellect capable of grasping concepts that would shatter most minds. The Xerion integration was proceeding rapidly, too rapidly perhaps. The woman's eyes held the slightly distant look of someone processing information at superhuman speeds. Commander Thex Voidrender followed, his cybernetic enhancements creating interesting harmonics with the fragment of Xerion technology he carried. Lyric could see the potential in him, the way his warrior's discipline might be channeled into purposes greater than conquest. His golden reptilian eyes swept the chamber with professional assessment, before settling on her with surprising respect. Behind them came a small group of others, crew members who had been changed by proximity to the armor. Their transformations, still in early stages but unmistakable to Lyric's enhanced perceptions. "Welcome," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond normal hearing. "I am Lyric Starweaver, keeper of this sanctuary and guardian of truths that most of the galaxy has forgotten. You have questions, I have answers, but be warned. Knowledge once gained cannot be ungained." Zara stepped forward, the patterns on her armor pulsing in rhythm with the sanctuary's own luminescent displays. "We need to understand what we've become. The armor shows me fragments, images of battles fought across dimensions, civilizations, rising and falling, threats that exist outside normal space-time. But I can't piece it together into a coherent whole." "That's because you're thinking too small," Lyric replied, gesturing toward the crystalline formations that lined the chamber. "Waltz, approach the memory crystals. Let them show you the truth of what the Xerian Empire truly was." As Zara moved toward the nearest crystal formation, Lyric turned to Thex. "And you, Commander, carry more than just a fragment of armor. Your people's shamans were wiser than they knew when they sent you on this quest." Thex's clawed hand moved instinctively to the small shrine he'd brought from his ship. "What do you know of Draconian history? I know that your ancestors weren't just warriors in service to the Xerion Empire. They were guardians of dimensional stability, tasked with protecting reality itself from incursions that originated beyond the boundaries of normal existence." Before Thex could respond, Zara gasped. Her hand had made contact with the largest memory crystal, and images were flooding through the hall, not just visual, but experiential memories that painted reality in ways that transcended normal sensory input. They saw the Xerion Empire at its height, not as a conventional galactic civilization, but as a network of consciousness that spanned multiple dimensions simultaneously. Beings of pure thought worked alongside creatures of living mathematics, their combined intellects focused on maintaining the barriers between realities. The armor they created wasn't just protective gear. It was a symbiotic interface that allowed mortal minds to perceive and interact with forces that existed beyond the three-dimensional universe. But they also saw the Empire's downfall. The Xerion had grown proud, believing themselves capable of controlling forces that were fundamentally beyond control. They had opened doorways to realms that should have remained sealed, contacted intelligences that viewed reality itself as something to be reshaped according to their alien geometries. The war that followed couldn't be described in conventional terms. Battles were fought not just across space but across possibility itself, with entire timelines being rewritten as weapons. Worlds were transformed into geometric impossibilities. Species were altered at the quantum level, their basic nature rewritten to serve purposes that challenged the foundations of existence. In the end, the Xerion had won only by destroying themselves. The greatest minds of the Empire had voluntarily scattered their consciousness across the galaxy, embedding fragments of their knowledge and power into armor that would lie dormant until worthy successors could be found. It was not victory. It was a desperate hope that someday, when the ancient enemy inevitably returned, there would be champions ready to stand against them. "The barriers are weakening," Lyric said as the memory crystal's display faded. "The entities the Xerion fought are pressing against the walls of reality once more. We felt them probing, testing, searching for ways to break through into our dimension." Zara staggered back from the crystal, her armor's patterns now pulsing in synchronization with the sanctuary's deeper rhythms. "How long do we have?" "Years, perhaps decades. Time moves differently for beings that exist outside conventional space-time. But the signs are unmistakable. Reality distortions are increasing throughout the galaxy. Vessels are disappearing in regions where space-time should be stable. And most tellingly, the armor fragments are awakening at an accelerated rate." She gestured toward a section of the chamber where holographic displays showed star maps marked with pulsing indicators. "In the past month alone, 7 new armor bearers have emerged. The network is rebuilding itself, but we're still far from the strength the original Xerion Empire possessed." Thex stepped forward, his cybernetic processors, analyzing the tactical implications. How many armor fragments exist? How many potential bearers? The exact number was lost when the Empire fell, but our estimates suggest several hundred fragments scattered across this galaxy alone. Some are complete suits like yours. She nodded to Zara. Others are smaller pieces that might only enhance specific capabilities. The challenge isn't finding them. They're actively seeking out compatible minds. The challenge is preparing those minds for what they'll face. And the enemy? These entities from beyond reality? Lyric's expression grew grave. They are called the Unmakers, though that's merely the closest translation our languages can manage. They exist in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps between mathematical equations, in the pause between heartbeats. They view organized reality as an aberration to be corrected, consciousness as a disease to be cured. They don't destroy civilizations. They edit them out of existence entirely, rewriting the fundamental laws of physics to ensure such anomalies never arise again. She moved to another section of the chamber, where ancient artifacts floated in containment fields that seemed to bend light around them. These are the only physical evidence we have of civilizations that encountered the Unmakers and lost. Not ruins or debris, conceptual fragments, pieces of ideas that once represented entire species but were edited down to mathematical footnotes. The implication struck Zara like a physical blow. If they succeed, the universe becomes perfectly ordered, perfectly predictable, and perfectly empty of anything resembling life, consciousness, or purpose. Reality becomes nothing more than an elegant equation expressing absolute zero. For several minutes the chamber fell silent, except for the subtle harmonics of the sanctuary systems. The weight of responsibility was settling on the newcomers, the understanding that they weren't just wearing ancient armor, but carrying the hopes of countless civilizations that had never even known they were under threat. Finally, Thex spoke. "What do we do?" "We learn," Lyric replied. "We grow stronger. We find the other fragments and help their bearers understand what they've become. And when the time comes, when the barriers finally fail and the Unmakers break through into our reality, we stand together and fight for the right of consciousness to exist." She turned back toward the observation deck, where the cosmic dust swirled in patterns that seemed almost like writing when viewed from the correct angle. "But first, you must understand that wearing Zerion armor changes you in ways that go beyond the physical. You become part of a network that spans galaxies and dimensions. Your thoughts, your experiences, your very essence becomes connected to every other armor bearer who has ever lived." As if to demonstrate her point, the armor patterns on Zara's suit began to resonate with frequencies that awakened dormant systems throughout the sanctuary. Lights that had been dim for decades blazed to life. Crystalline formations that had been inactive began to sing with harmonic frequencies that seemed to carry meaning beyond words. "The network is awakening," Lyric whispered, her ancient eyes reflecting depths of memory and possibility. "For the first time in millennia, we have enough active bearers to begin true coordination. The question now is whether we can build our strength quickly enough to face what's coming." In the depths of space, beyond the reach of conventional sensors, reality rippled. Something vast and impossible turned its attention toward the galaxy, sensing the disturbance caused by the reawakening network of Zerion armor. The Unmakers had been patient for eons, waiting for the barriers to weaken sufficiently for their return. That patience was about to be rewarded. The unity awakening, the convergence point at the galaxy's core, was dying. Zara Blackthorn watched through the Shadow Claw's enhanced sensors as reality twisted into impossible geometries around the massive black hole that anchored their spiral arm. What should have been empty space filled with the distorted matter of collapsing stars instead writhed with structures that hurt to perceive directly, angles that folded back on themselves, surfaces that existed in more dimensions than space should allow, colors that had no names because they had never existed in any natural spectrum. "The barriers have failed completely." Lyric's voice carried a weight of centuries as she stood beside the tactical display, her ancient fingers tracing patterns in the air that made the ship's quantum sensors recalibrate themselves. The Unmakers aren't just breaking through, they're rewriting the fundamental structure of space-time itself. Commander Thex Voidrender studied the readings with the focused intensity of a predator analyzing prey, though what they faced was beyond any earthly hunt. His cybernetic enhancements were struggling to process data that defied conventional physics, quantum processors overheating as they tried to make sense of mathematical impossibilities. "Fleet status report," he commanded, his voice carrying across the bridge to where representatives from dozens of species worked in unprecedented cooperation. 67 armor bearers have responded to the convergence call, reported his tactical officer, a young human whose recent integration with a fragment of Xerian technology allowed her to interface directly with the combined fleet's systems. "We have vessels from the Draconian clans, the Alteran Defense Force, 3 human colonial fleets and—" She paused, checking readings that shouldn't have been possible. 17 ships of pure Xerion construction that materialized from dimensional folds 2 hours ago, and our opposition. The main display shifted to show sensor readings from the convergence point itself. What they revealed challenged sanity, not ships or weapons in any conventional sense, but manifestations of concept and intent that had taken on quasi-physical form. The Unmakers existed as living mathematics, equations of destruction that rewrote the rules of existence simply by being present in normal space-time. They're not trying to destroy the galaxy, Zara realized, her armor's enhanced perception allowing her to grasp patterns that were invisible to unaugmented minds. They're trying to solve it, to reduce everything to the simplest possible mathematical expression, which would be 0, Lyric confirmed grimly. Perfect order, perfect emptiness, perfect silence. Through the quantum network that connected all armor bearers, Zara could feel the presence of her allies scattered across the assembled fleet. 67 minds touched by forces beyond mortal comprehension, each carrying fragments of knowledge and power that had once protected reality itself. But even combined, they were a pale shadow of what the original Xerion Empire had commanded. "We need to get closer," she said, studying the tactical display with growing certainty. The armor fragments aren't just individual weapons, they're components of a larger system. But they need proximity to achieve full integration. Thex's golden eyes narrowed. "Closer means entering the distortion field. Our ships won't survive conventional space-time becoming that unstable. Then we don't use conventional ships." Lyric stepped forward, her expression carrying the weight of decisions that would echo across dimensions. "There is a way, but it requires trust beyond anything your species have ever attempted. The armor network can sustain itself independently of physical vessels, but only if the bearers are willing to surrender individual identity to become part of a collective consciousness." "Temporary surrender?" Zara asked. "Or permanent?" "Unknown. The original Xerion who attempted this technique were never seen again, though whether they died or transcended into something beyond physical existence remains a mystery." The bridge fell silent except for the subtle harmonics of alien technologies attempting to coexist. Through the viewports, they could see the convergence point growing brighter as more of space-time collapsed into the Unmakers' preferred mathematical expressions. Entire star systems were being edited out of existence, their component matter reorganized into perfect crystalline structures that expressed universal constants with geometric precision. "How long until the effect spreads beyond the galactic core?" Thex asked. At current rates of expansion, Lyric's voice was barely above a whisper. "Perhaps 18 hours before inhabited systems begin experiencing reality distortions. 72 hours before the effect becomes irreversible across the entire galaxy." Zara felt the weight of countless civilizations settling on her shoulders. Through the armor's network, she could sense the fear and confusion of beings across the galaxy as their fundamental understanding of reality began to break down. Children on distant worlds were reporting that the sky was changing color into numbers. Scientists were discovering that basic physical laws were becoming suggestions rather than rules. "I'll do it," she said, the decision crystallizing with absolute certainty. Whatever the risks, they're preferable to watching consciousness itself get edited out of existence. "As will I," Thex added, his clawed hand resting on the fragment of Zerion technology that had guided him across the galaxy. My people face extinction regardless. If there's a chance this could save not just them but everyone, then we stand together, Lyric concluded, her ancient eyes reflecting depths of memory and possibility. Signal the fleet. All armor bearers are to prepare for network integration. We have one chance to become what the original Zerion could not, truly unified in purpose rather than power. The process began with the smallest fragments first. Across the fleet, individuals who had been changed by contact with Zerion technology felt their consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of flesh and circuitry. A draconian engineer whose prosthetic arm contained a sliver of living metal found himself seeing through the eyes of a human navigator, whose neural implants had been transformed by proximity to an ancient relic. An Alteran diplomat whose ceremonial jewelry had awakened. With Zerion patterns discovered, she could feel the thoughts of crystalline entities that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. As the network grew stronger, the assembled fleet began to change. Ships designed by different species for incompatible purposes started reconfiguring themselves, their hulls flowing like liquid metal as Zerion technology spread through their systems. Weapons designed for conventional warfare transformed into instruments for manipulating the fundamental forces of reality. Engines that had once pushed matter through normal space learned to slip between dimensions. Zara felt her individual identity beginning to blur at the edges as 67 minds touched hers across impossible distances. She was still herself, but she was also Thex, discovering the true courage required to save a dying race. Lyric carrying the weight of millennial knowledge and dozens of others whose names and species became less important than their shared determination to preserve the right of consciousness to exist. The unified fleet moved toward the convergence point, not as separate vessels but as components of a single organism dedicated to a single purpose. Reality twisted around them, but instead of being destroyed by the distortions, they learned to navigate them, using the Unmaker's own weapon, the malleability of space-time, against them. As they entered the heart of the distortion field, the true scope of the threat became clear. The Unmakers weren't simply aliens with advanced technology. They were the mathematical expression of entropy itself, the universe's tendency toward disorder and decay given consciousness and purpose. They existed in the gaps between equations, in the spaces where logic broke down, in the moments when ordered thought gave way to chaos. They're not evil, Zara realized as her expanded consciousness touched the edge of an Unmaker's attention. They genuinely believe they're correcting an error. To them, consciousness is a statistical anomaly that disrupts the elegant simplicity of pure mathematics. Then we'll have to prove them wrong, Thex's voice carried across the network, his warrior's instincts transforming into something deeper and more profound. We'll show them that consciousness isn't a flaw in the universe. It's the universe learning to understand itself. The battle that followed couldn't be described in conventional terms. There were no explosions or energy beams, no shields failing or hulls breaching. Instead, there was a contest of fundamental concepts: order versus complexity, simplicity versus possibility, mathematical perfection versus the beautiful chaos of conscious thought. The unified armor-bearers fought not with weapons, but with ideas, countering the Unmaker's efforts to reduce reality to simple equations by demonstrating the infinite complexity that consciousness could achieve. Where the Unmakers tried to edit civilizations out of existence, the Armor Network rewrote them back into being. Where reality was simplified into crystalline perfection, the bearers introduced the controlled chaos of growth and change. But the cost was enormous. With each act of preservation and creation, the individual identities within the network became more diffuse. Zara could feel herself becoming something larger and stranger, her personal memories and experiences merging with those of beings she had never met from species she couldn't name. We're losing ourselves, someone, herself, observed across the network. No, came Lyric's ancient wisdom. We're becoming what the Zerion Empire could have been if they had learned to truly work together, instead of merely coordinating their individual powers. The realization struck like lightning across the network. The original Zerion had failed not because they lacked power, but because they had remained fundamentally separate. Each armor-bearer had been an individual enhanced by technology, rather than part of a truly unified consciousness. When the crisis had come, they had fought as brilliant individuals, rather than as a collective intelligence. But consciousness, the armor-bearers now understood, was inherently about connection. The links between neurons, between thoughts, between individuals that created something greater than the sum of its parts. The Unmakers saw only the mathematics of individual units and tried to optimize them into non-existence. They couldn't comprehend that the true power of consciousness lay in the relationships between those units. Drawing on this understanding, the unified network began to change its approach. Instead of fighting the Unmakers' attempts to mathematically optimize reality, they embraced those attempts while introducing new variables into the equations, variables that accounted for choice, growth, creativity, and the infinite potential of minds working in harmony. Slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. The crystal structures that the Unmakers had created to express universal constants began to incorporate new patterns, fractals that spiraled into infinity, equations that generated beauty as well as truth, mathematical expressions that celebrated complexity rather than eliminating it. At the convergence point itself, where the galaxy's central black hole was being transformed into an engine of cosmic editing, reality began to stabilize. Not into the rigid perfection the Unmakers sought, but into something more complex and wonderful. A dynamic equilibrium between order and chaos, structure and possibility, mathematics and meaning. The Unmakers, faced with equations that became more rather than less complex when solved, began to withdraw. They were not defeated. Beings of pure concept could not be destroyed in any conventional sense, but they were convinced. Consciousness, they finally understood, was not an error to be corrected, but a feature of reality so fundamental that trying to edit it out made the universe itself less mathematically elegant, not more. As the distortion field collapsed and normal spacetime reasserted itself around the galactic core, the unified network began to separate back into individual consciousness. But the separation was not complete. Threads of connection remained, linking the armor-bearers across impossible distances in a web of shared understanding and purpose. Zara found herself back in her own body, her own thoughts, but enriched by echoes of every mind she had touched. Beside her, Thex was discovering that his people's genetic plague had been healed not through conventional medicine, but through the network's ability to rewrite the quantum structure of their DNA. Lyric smiled with satisfaction deeper than her ancient features should have been able to express, seeing the promise of the Zerion Empire finally fulfilled in a way its original creators had never imagined. "Is it over?" someone asked across the bridge. "This crisis is over," Lyric replied, her gaze turning toward distant stars where reality had been restored but forever changed. "But we are no longer the same beings who began this journey. We are something new, individual minds that remember what it means to be truly unified, consciousness that understands its place in the cosmic equation not as an error to be corrected, but as the variable that makes all other variables meaningful." Through the quantum network that still connected them, the armor-bearers could feel the galaxy beginning to heal. On distant worlds, children who had watched the sky become numbers were laughing as stars returned to their proper colors. Scientists were discovering that the fundamental laws of physics had been subtly enhanced, allowing for possibilities that had never existed before. And in the spaces between realities, other threats that had watched the Unmakers' assault began to reconsider their own plans for cosmic dominion. The galaxy now contained something unprecedented, a collective of individual consciousness that could act as one without losing their essential diversity. Zara Blackthorne, xenoarchaeologist turned guardian of reality itself, stood at the observation deck of the sanctuary and watched the cosmic dust swirl in patterns that now seemed almost like applause. The veil of Zerion had been lifted, revealing not just ancient secrets but the infinite potential of minds willing to work together for something greater than themselves. The armor had chosen wisely.